guys, welcome back to Project Unstuck. This is episode 5, and I'm so excited to be joined with Dr. Morgan Levy. So Morgan is an executive strategist and licensed psychologist based in Florida with a PhD in clinical psychology. She specializes in helping high-achieving professionals learn the skills that they need to optimize their work performance without sacrificing their personal lives. I love that. She also has online workshops and other educational resources to help with perfectionism and burnout, which is why I was so excited to invite her to this interview today, because I know that she's going to have so much great value for us. But thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Project Unstuck.
Thank you, Stefanie. I am so excited to be here. I'm so passionate about this topic, and I'm excited to talk about it.
Let's dive right in, because there's so much that I want to cover, especially around burnout, because just to give you a little bit of context, a lot of my listeners for this project are stuck in either unfulfilling careers or just that endless job search where they're applying to maybe hundreds of places and they're not really hearing back. So in either case, both groups are very burnt out, because when we're stuck, that's just sort of an inevitable byproduct. But that's really why this is an important topic, because I'm really trying to help my audience get unstuck. But when they're burnt out, that really reduces the motivation and the drive that we need to get unstuck. So I want to talk through some of the different strategies and tips that you have around burnout, starting with, let's actually back up. So what are some early warning signs of burnouts? Because I know when I was burnt out, I didn't realize it until it was way too late and it was hitting me right in the face.
Yeah, the great question. Most people don't realize that they're experiencing burnout until they're right in the thick of it, when they're overwhelmed, they have headaches, they feel physically exhausted, and they're just ready to take a 6-month vacation. They're done.
That's what I did.
Yeah, it's so chronic. And really the best way to address burnout is, like what you said, recognizing the early signs, because a lot of times also the early signs are signs that we would never even think are early signs of burnout. So the first one is that compulsion to prove yourself, because it's exciting. You're at work, you're excited, you're ready to show that you can do everything. You're putting aside your hobbies, your needs, you're neglecting maybe family or friends just because you're so excited to work, because it is fun and you do enjoy it.
Yeah.
But then it starts happening over and over again. And you might notice that when you succeed at something, you're not really excited about it, and you immediately start thinking about the next thing. So you get into this endless cycle of just working harder and experiencing this excessive need to prove yourself. That's usually how it starts to show up first.
I know in my experience, some of the symptoms I had, and I'd love to hear if this is something that you see with some of your patients that are experiencing burnout. I had a very low tolerance for any kind of adversity. So I would be snapping at my family, and I'm normally a very happy person. But when I was living at home and I had this burnout, I got very moody. I had no tolerance for any kind of adversity. I was really having issues with sleeping. I had a headache, a stomach ache. Are all of these things caused by burnout?
They are. So burnout can show up with lashing out, maybe being more irritable, feeling on edge. It could show up physically, like what you were saying, headaches, stomach aches, problems sleeping, problems with concentration. Some people might notice that they can't sleep because they're just thinking about what happened throughout the day, maybe ruminating on what they said and feeling a little anxious about it. It could show up as indecisiveness and not knowing what to do. And it could also show up as boredom, which some people don't realize. But when you start to feel bored over and over again, that's also a sign that you might be heading towards burnout.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I would have never thought of that, but I think it does make sense, especially when we find ourselves in careers that really don't light us up. Which brings me to my next question. What are some of the big leading causes of burnout? Is there anything that really stands out so that our listeners, if it's not too late, which it probably is for many people, they're already burnt out at this point. But if not, what are some of the leading causes so people can be aware of it and kind of pull their energy back from things that aren't serving them?
So burnout in just the psychology world is a workplace type of phenomenon. So it's usually when we're feeling overworked, overburdened, stressed, exhausted, and like our workload is too high. So that usually is one of the most common causes. But of course, there's people who experience that and they don't ever feel burned out. They thrive in it. So sometimes it comes down to our individual differences. And one that I've noticed the most is perfectionism.
Oh, okay. Yeah, can you talk to me a little bit more about that? Because I was wondering, if someone is a perfectionist or a high achiever, but let's focus on perfectionism right now, does that make them more likely to end up burnt out? Why does that happen?
Yeah. So a perfectionist has expectations that can never be met. So they're constantly working, moving forward, trying things to meet those expectations. But the problem is they're never satisfied. They never experience that fulfillment because nothing ever feels good enough for them. And so they just keep going, keep working, keep moving forward. Perfectionists are motivated by the fear of failure instead of by the excitement and thrill of success.
How can people start to manage it if they're finding themselves really burnt out? Let's say they can't even afford or they don't have the option to take a leave of absence, which is what I did. What are some ways that they can manage it that you recommend?
Mm-hmm. So I also want to emphasize that whatever skills and strategies I share, they're not going to be as effective if you're in a very toxic work environment. And I understand that society and some of these workplaces really don't make it easy. So knowing that, one of the top tips that has been suggested by research is taking a 20-minute intentional rest break for every 90 minutes of work. Wow. And I know that could be really hard to incorporate, but research shows that by doing that, we're then more effective at what we do later on.
Okay.
And that 20-minute break has to be really intentionally restful. It isn't just scrolling through your phone or going on social media, but doing something that you know will recharge you. Okay.
So let's look at it now through the lens of managing burnout in our personal lives, because I think in our careers, that 20-minute break sounds like a really great way to manage it. But what are things that we can do in our personal lives? Because it's my inclination to believe that when we're sort of playing and having fun and experiencing good, moments with our friends and family, that can help us. But I don't know that that's true. So do you have any thoughts on that? And is there anything that you recommend for people to sort of manage burnout in their personal lives?
Yeah. So social support and having a strong network is so important and helps so much. So that's absolutely true. Having a life outside of work and having a life that is meaningful and fulfilling to you can help decrease burnout.
Okay.
And also being able to say no and set boundaries when needed and when appropriate makes such a difference.
Yes, boundaries are so important. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's go right back to perfectionism. So this is a huge issue with my audience. This is an issue that I dealt with for years. I'm getting a lot better at it. But what are some tips that you have to sort of kick that perfectionism to the curb? Because I think we both know that when you're a perfectionist, you really are blocking yourself from a lot of success and forward movement, and putting something out there in its sort of 30%, 40% formed, in your brain, it's only 30%, perfect. It's better than nothing, in my opinion. So how can people start to move away from these perfectionist tendencies?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing that I've noticed with perfectionists is that most of them don't even think they're a perfectionist, and then they don't try anything because they don't think they are one. Okay. But usually they are. And the reason that they don't think they're one is because they're not perfect and they're constantly striving to be. So the first step is to recognize that perfectionism is likely showing up. Then my favorite tip is the concept of being good enough. So what that involves, and sometimes I notice that people struggle with doing this because they don't want to just be good enough. They want to be perfect. And I get it. There's some areas of your life and your career where you have to pay really close attention to detail and you have to exceed some expectations. I have a friend, she's an attorney, and she said, my perfectionism is what made me partner in my firm. And I get it. You have to do that in some areas, but you don't have to be perfect everywhere. And so that's where good enough comes up. So there's probably areas in your life where you're working 10,000 times harder than you need to be to get the same result that you would have if you didn't. Like, and so what I like to work on is recognizing where we can be good enough and still succeed the way that we need to without being perfect. And that could show up at home. Like maybe you don't need to have a perfectly clean home. Maybe it could just be good enough, and that's okay. I get a lot of pushback when I teach this at first because people just it's so hard for them to accept that. But once you start practicing it in areas that are easier, you'll see how it's able to show up in other areas and be effective.
I can see how a lot of those high achievers, people pleaser types, I'm one of them, would have a lot of resistance to that good enough concept. But I honestly, that's really how I've been trying to integrate more balance and just forward momentum as, in my own life. And that's what I do with, creating a social post. I used to spend all this time, trying to create the perfect social post. And then I would eat away all of this time. As an entrepreneur, I can't afford that. So I've started to try to adopt that habit of making it good enough. But you would mention that some perfectionists don't even realize that they're perfectionists. So how can people see this in themselves, especially if they're a little doubtful that they are showing these signs?
Yeah, so people usually think of a perfectionist as somebody who is clean, organized, has it all together, and is always successful and gets stuff done, but it doesn't always show up that way. Perfectionists usually are so disorganized because they're trying to manage so many different things. A perfectionist tends to procrastinate a lot because it's a lot easier for them to procrastinate and avoid something than it is for them to do something and fail, because that's one of their biggest fears. So that's one of the top signs that typically shows up. A perfectionist also doesn't necessarily show full genuineness in relationships. They try to put up a front because they're worried of being found out as an imposter or a fraud. They're always putting on a performance. Like if at the end of the day, you're home and you're alone and you're just let out like a deep breath and it feels like you can be yourself and you are putting on a performance all day, it's likely that you have some perfectionism going on.
Okay. And you had mentioned fear of failure. How can we sort of move past that? What is I honestly would just tell my clients feel the fear and do it anyways, but that might be a little oversimplistic. So what are some strategies that you recommend to help people get over that? Both, the fear of failure, fear of judgment, because those are really big things that are showing up.
Yeah, so in my work, what I typically focus on is understanding where something came from, because when you have that understanding, it becomes a lot easier to recognize when it's showing up and then push against it when needed. And so typically that fear of failure comes from a message that we received growing up from our teachers, parents, caregivers, really anybody, that achievement and success is equal to our worth. So, we get a lot of praise. We get all of those awards for doing well. And we eventually, as kids, we internalize this message that we will get love and acceptance if we do well. And so then we always have this pressure to keep doing well and to do something because we're worried that if we show that we have flaws or we can make a mistake or we won't succeed, then we won't be loved or accepted anymore. So once we make that connection, it becomes a lot easier to then move past that.
Okay, so that awareness is really important. So let's change gears a bit. If someone let's say they just got fired from their job, or they're stuck in a really unfulfilling, mismatched career, what are some of the first steps that they can take to begin identifying a new career path? Because a lot of the times when people are finding themselves in either of these situations, there's a lack of clarity in how to move forward. So how can people begin to move forward and find that clarity?
So when it comes to clarity and trying to figure out what somebody wants moving forward, I think it's important to take a step back and understand what your values are. And it could be very simple as thinking about who you want to be as a person. What do you value? How do you want to show up in relationships, at work, in your hobbies, with your own personal self-growth, recognizing what you value there. And then when you move forward, determine if every action you take or every job that you're looking for Does that align with what your values are? And it's an ongoing process, and our values can change over time, but continuously checking in and that self-reflection helps us live a more fulfilling life.
Right. And I actually did this exercise. I was trying to identify my own values when I was in this position, and I had just taken a leave of absence, and I was incredibly burnt out, and I felt like I was starting from ground zero. This career I'd been working towards my whole life, not my whole life, but most of my life, had kind of just crumbled right before my eyes, and I lost so much direction. I felt so confused with where to go next. And so I did work through different values exercises. And the way I did it is simply by looking up a list of values, writing down all the ones that resonated with me, and then circling my top 3 to 5. But is there a more refined way of doing this that you recommend, or is that, does that work?
That's actually like a research-based, evidence-based technique that a lot of therapists use. So it's pretty effective because it helps with that clarity and that understanding. If you wanted to take it a step further, you could take those values and look at different areas of your life and see if you're using or like acting in accordance with those values in different areas.
How can we know when a job is aligned with our values? Is there some sort of green flags to look out for? Is it simply by, paying attention to the job posting? Is there anything that you know of that can help us point that out?
So I wouldn't necessarily know with a job posting, but once you're in a job to know if it feels in alignment, you just check in with your feelings, with your emotions, with your thoughts, what your experiences are, your energy levels. And of course, keep in mind also starting a new job at first is going to feel exhausting, maybe a little bit overwhelming. Yes. So it could be helpful to give it a chance.
Yes. Okay. No, I think that's so important. And that's a great way to start identifying what is wrong, because this is something that I experience in a lot of my audiences. You're in a job, you're extremely burnt out, extremely unhappy, but you don't know why. I look back at my journal from this period and I was so confused. I was really trying to find all the positives. I was trying to practice gratitude daily and look for that silver lining. But I didn't have a great understanding of what was so wrong until I did a lot of this work in the values exercises. But that's just something that I think people need to be aware of is if something feels off in your job, look at your values and see if there's a mismatch there. But I wanted to go back a bit and talk about the perfectionism again. So especially if someone is trying to create a personal brand, and this is really what I believe is that building a personal brand is a really great way to get unstuck. Because when you're creating content, you're sort of getting clarity on what do I actually enjoy? How can we use social media as a testing ground to experiment with some lesser explored passions and interests? And so that's one reason I believe it helps you get unstuck. But the other is when you're creating high value content, you are attracting a lot of opportunities, whether that be brand deals or podcasts or partners, job offers, etc., which is another reason I think it's a great way to get unstuck. But because we have a lot of perfectionists, and perfectionism is a big block to creating content, and I think this also kind of shows up as a comparison trap. Do you have any tips for dealing with that and avoid falling into the comparison trap? Because this is what I see as a really big block to people creating content consistently over time.
Yes, because it's all about trying to be perfect. That's our mindset these days. It's so hard. So I would remember it's all about progress, not perfection. And when you're putting out stuff, something that I like to do is just think if it helps one person, if the message reaches one person, then it was worth it for me.
Yep.
And that really is what helped me get through it and to put out whatever I've wanted to put out into the world.
Yes. Okay. So you have your own personal brand and you've been creating content. Has that helped you in advancing your own career? What have you seen from that?
Yeah. So I'm working on developing an 8-week group program to help people who are experiencing burnout and perfectionism. And in order to get that out into the world, I have to put out content so people can hear about it and learn about it and, decide if they need it. And at first, putting out stuff was really difficult because I could be afraid that I might stumble or make mistakes, or people might not like it, or might not like me, or I might get some troll sending, mean messages. And it took me a while to get myself to do it. And then I just decided I couldn't hold any of this in anymore because I was so passionate about it.
Yeah.
But, it's still difficult. And I've begun to kind of own my mistakes.
And how do you recommend people deal with those haters and trolls? Because that's inevitable. And especially as you grow your personal brand and you gain a larger following, you're going to gain an equal amount of, haters. So what can people do to kind of tune that out and not worry so much about it?
Well, there's so many different routes you can take. If you've received any positive feedback, I would recommend keeping that in some sort of file or folder or notebook and looking back at it to remember, how you have been helpful and some of the praise that you received. Because we're always going to have people who don't like us. That's just anybody. Even if you're not trying to build a personal brand, people aren't going to like you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard to remember that because sometimes we tend to put other people on these pedestals, not realizing that they're just people too.
Yes. I love that you mentioned that tip about taking screenshots or kind of getting all of your kind feedback. I've actually done that as well. I have a folder on my phone of just, positive messages or feedback or, messages of thanks and appreciation. And I will look back at that when I'm struggling, and that fuels me to keep creating, which is another big reason I believe that this is a great way to get unstuck, building your personal brand, creating content, because you will get so many amazing messages from your audience that provides, for me personally, that provided such a deep sense of fulfillment. And I think that's what a lot of us are lacking. And I think that is a reason that we can end up burnt out if we're lacking that fulfillment in what we're doing. That's how I ended up burnt out, I believe. But definitely take that tip around, taking screenshots, put that in a folder, save it for, a rainy day. But another thing I love to think about is that we're all just sort of mirrors for each other. And if someone is being cruel to you or mean to you, it really is just a reflection of them. It's just sort of showing that they're going through a hard time. And so especially as we begin to sort of go outside the box, build our personal brand, create content, we'll see, wow, this person is stepping outside the box and they're going, beyond their job description, and they're really sharing value. And I think that does hold up a mirror to some people and sort of highlight what they're not doing. And of course, that's not our intention, but I do think that's important to remember because this is a really challenging thing, especially in the beginning when you're just starting to deal with the haters and you're like, whoa, this was the nicest post. Like, how can anyone disagree with that? So definitely keep that in mind. One book I read that really helped me with this was The Four Agreements, and it really just helped me distance myself from other people's opinions of me and realize that their opinions of me are really none of my business. And it's not a reflection of me, it's just a reflection of them. I wanted to touch on as well imposter syndrome, which you had mentioned briefly, because this is a really, really prevalent issue. I've struggled with it a lot, and I know a lot of people do, especially the high achievers and the people pleasers. Why is that? Do you know if there's like a reason for those kinds of people to end up feeling like imposters?
Yeah, and it's so funny because I've worked with a lot of people at different levels of, the workforce, and like the highest executive level people I've worked with will come to me and say, I still feel like a kid. And they feel like imposters. So more people than you realize typically experience it. Mm-hmm. And I think that also comes down to, similarly to the perfectionism, whereas you've learned throughout your life that you have to be successful, achieve, have like outcomes in order to be worth anything. And so that also contributes to low self-esteem because we haven't learned that our own internal self is value and worthy on its own. Mm. So when we have that, we begin to feel like an imposter if we're not constantly achieving. And a lot of people feel like when they get to that level that they're only achieving what they do due to luck. It's hard to realize that it comes from within, that we are working and we are doing it to get to that.
Yeah. So how can we counter that? What can we do to not fall into that imposter syndrome trap. And again, especially for people creating content, this is going to show up a lot. So how can they deal with that?
Mm-hmm. So a couple of things. You can write down all of your strengths and ask maybe like a close friend or a colleague to write down what they view as your strengths and how they view your work. And then you can see it from an outside perspective. And then also recognizing that it's such a common phenomenon for people to experience that. Like you're not alone. That can make it a lot easier.
Yes.
Remembering also progress, not perfection. Like I say that over and over again, or good enough, not perfection. And remembering that makes it a lot easier to work through it.
And do you notice that more women are facing imposter syndrome? Do you know why that is?
My guess is the way that society is and the messages that we receive from society, from the workplace and all the different changes, it sort of reinforces that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you had mentioned something earlier about how, and this was something that I relate to so much of what we're talking about, but again, this was something I really experienced is I got a lot of praise from my family and my friends when I achieved something. That external success was my biggest motivator for so long. And my identity was so inextricably linked with my job and my achievements. But a lot of people that have reached out to me about this project, they don't even have that kind of support from their family and friends. There's a lack of just presence in their lives. So for those people that don't really have that strong support system within their family, how can they either find that within themselves or maybe find that within other communities so that we do feel that support, because we all need it to some degree. So what can people do to find that?
Yeah, so social support and having a strong network it's so important, and it doesn't have to be family. So especially for women, I would recommend looking out and finding other women professional groups or support groups, finding people and women in particular who just want to uplift each other and help each other grow.
Yeah.
And these days there's so many of those platforms online.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you can even find them on Facebook groups. Joining any kind of container with people that are in a similar boat to you, I have found is honestly one of the most valuable things, because only the people that are doing or have done what you're trying to do can really relate and give you advice that is potentially worth taking. And so we don't want to take the advice from people that haven't done what we're trying to do. So look for those different containers. I've joined them with group coaching programs, with masterminds and Facebook groups. So there's a lot of different ways that you can access these groups, and they don't necessarily always have to be paid. So I think that's something that people should try to keep in mind. But let me sort of zoom out a bit, because again, this is about getting unstuck. So is there anything that pops into your mind as like a behavior or a habit that keeps us stuck?
Yes. And that is the shoulds. So sometimes we might think we need to, like, I should be doing this. I shouldn't procrastinate. I should help everybody. And these shoulds keep us stuck because it's not what we truly want or we truly need. Shoulds usually come from some sort of external expectation. And when we're doing something because we think we should do it, or it's coming from outside of us, it's not as powerful or as motivating as when it comes from, within us. And so what I typically recommend for people is to just track their shoulds throughout the day. If they notice that they're saying, oh, I should do this, or I shouldn't do this, or I should have done that. Any of that, I suggest tracking it. Determine if it's something that you truly believe and value and feels true to you. And if it is, try to reframe it in a way that it's where you say, I need to do this, or I want to do it, because then it comes from within you, and it increases that motivation.
So we know that a lot of our audience, or my audience, is burnt out. And when they're burnt out and they're feeling stuck and they're just in the situation where they don't know where to go next, it is so easy to get overwhelmed. So do you have any tips to manage that overwhelm so that it doesn't paralyze us?
One of my favorite tips is the stop technique. And it's an opportunity for us to check in with ourselves to see what we're experiencing in the moment to determine what we need next. So that stands for, like, I want you to imagine a stop sign. The S stands for stop. The T is take a breath. O is observe. And I'll talk about that in a second. And P is proceed, to move forward. And the O is one of the most important steps in there because it stands for observe, which is observing what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and then also going through your senses, you know, what you see, what you hear, what you taste, what you smell, what you feel. That technique helps bring us into the mindful state of mind and practice mindfulness, which is basically just awareness in the moment. And research shows that the more we get ourselves into that mindful brain and that state of mind, it decreases our level of anxiety, overwhelm, burnout, maybe even sometimes depression and even loneliness, because it's grounding ourselves to the present moment.
That's so important. And I actually spoke about this with our last guest for episode 4 about the importance of presence and how impactful it can be. And as someone who has bad anxiety, practicing presence and really bringing myself back into my body has been one of the easiest and most effective ways of getting out of that spiral and really just positioning myself as the watcher. And so again, this was something I spoke about last week with Jessica, but really if you can take yourself out of your brain and realize I am not my thoughts, this is not, every thought I think is not my own, and it's not everything that I think, I don't need to listen to it. But when you take a step back and you look at your thoughts as if they are someone else's and you position yourself as the watcher, that can also help create that separation and bring you into the present moment. And another technique I've used to bring myself into the present moment that I've learned in the book, The Power of Now, which highly recommend, that's by Eckhart Tolle, is feeling my inner body. And so you can start by just feeling your hands, feeling like the inner body of your hand, like it'll start feeling a little bit of tingling. And then you can kind of expand that awareness to your entire body, you know, moving slowly throughout each body part. That really helps me bring me back. That helps me bring myself back into the present moment. And I love the idea of using your senses. What can you see? What can you hear? That is such a great tip. And then in terms of, I'm not sure if you work with your patients on this, but do you have any sort of ways of planning or organizing that you recommend that people can do to avoid burnout and overwhelm and just feel like a little bit more on top of their work?
Yeah, so something that I have found my clients find really helpful is delegating, not taking everything on themselves. That is the biggest issue that they tend to struggle with, is they feel like they have to do it all. And again, it all goes back to the perfectionism where they feel like nobody else can meet their expectations. Mm-hmm. So trying to find the areas in your life where you can delegate then makes planning a lot easier. And then something they've also found helpful is what I like to call, and I'm sure other people use it, a to-done list, to not just write what you have to do, but to also write what you've accomplished so that you feel like that level of satisfaction.
Yes, that's such a great idea. And that's something I recently started doing just to recognize and celebrate myself for what I had achieved. And not every day is there a to-done list, because some days I just simply, you know, have, maybe it's a mental health issue or I'm too tired. So not every day needs to be this super productive day. But when you have those days, recognize it and give yourself the credit where it's due.
I also think, though, not doing anything and resting is still being productive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just as important.
I couldn't agree with that more. I honestly I'm trying to preach that so much, because we feel guilty when we rest, especially as these high achievers, people pleasers. We were, you know, raised in a society, a lot of us were, where our productivity and our output and doing things made us more valuable. And my father, he is one of those people that woke up really early every day to go to the city, to work super hard, get home late. And so the values that he sort of shared with me is that you work hard, you're valuable, that's how you find success. But I don't really agree with that. And I think that the value of rest is you can't really capture it, because it is invaluable. And especially if you're burnt out, please give yourself that time to rest. Please don't feel guilty. If you're not feeling as motivated, that's okay. That's a result of being so burnt out. But speaking of motivation, is there any tip that you have for people to help get a little bit more motivation? Of course, I know we can't sort of manifest it all entirely, especially when we're burnt out, but what are some things people can do to find that within themselves?
Mm-hmm. The first thing I would recommend is remembering why you're doing something. Because when you get connected with the meaning behind something, it becomes so much easier to do it because it drives you.
Mm-hmm. Find your why. That was actually what we covered in, was it last episode or 2 episodes ago? We unpacked, and this is, guys, be sure that you fill out the form on the landing page to actually gain access to all of this content. This is basically all kept within a course. So one of the exercises we did was identifying our motivator, finding our why. And that is honestly one of the most important things, but you have to pick something that genuinely triggers a strong emotional response in you, and probably that's aligned with your values. So I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I think that's just a prerequisite, especially if we're going on this journey to getting unstuck and we're trying to make radical change in our lives. Finding those 1 to 3 reasons why you're doing it, whether that's to gain more freedom and autonomy over your life, or to, create a thriving business for your family so they never have to work, or whatever it is. And it's unique to you. So don't judge yourself if the reason that's motivating you is a little bit different. As long as it motivates you and it gives you a real positive emotional response, I think that is good enough. But I want to wrap it up with just, what is your best tip for anyone that is finding themselves stuck in that unfulfilling career or this sort of futile job search? Is there anything that you really recommend to them?
Trusting yourself and checking in with yourself, trying not to live on autopilot.
That's so important. And the trust is really difficult. I had to really work on regaining that trust with myself back, because especially as perfectionists, if we're saying, oh, I'm going to do this paper, or I'm going to create this post, and then we don't, now we're saying something and we're going against our own word. And that erodes the trust that we have in ourselves. And so one thing that I love to do to sort of rebuild that trust is literally speak out loud what my intentions are to do something. Even if it's as simple as, I'm going to get in bed by 10 p.m. and I'm going to put my phone away, or I'm going to brush my teeth. It could be even simpler. But actually saying it and then following through is a really great way to rebuild that trust, because if we don't trust ourselves, a lot of the motivation and the drive and the inspiration that we need to move forward kind of just crumbles. So I'm so happy you mentioned that tip. I think that's everything that I wanted to ask you, and I so appreciate you joining us. I've learned so much. It's really incredible, and I know our listeners are going to get a ton out of this. But where can people find you?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. This has been a lot of fun. People can find me at my website, drmorganlevy.com, and it's drmorganlevy.com.
And do you have any free resources that you want to plug that might help people with any of these topics that we discussed?
Yeah, actually next week I'm doing a free 5-day challenge on overcoming burnout and moving beyond overwhelm. So anybody wants to sign up for that, I'm really excited. We're going to go through a bunch of tips and strategies together. There's a quiz on my website, a free quiz if you want to find out which obstacle might be holding you back, with a couple of tips on how to work through it.
That's so great. So guys, I'll leave a link for that in the description. Be sure to check that out. Thank you again. This was honestly incredible. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much.